The meeting is being recorded. Excellent. So let's have a share screen here. 32. Is that the one? Oops. Where is it? Good. Okay. Excellent. So now we're going to do something you haven't quite done before, but we're really going to go into the Ramaz Tshuva about the orphan bride in more detail than we have done in the past. Because we're going to take you through the mechanics of how his rabbinical legal mind works and what it means to be a posek, who has the whole of Shas, Rishonim, and any other authorities at his fingertips. We're not going to do the whole thing because that would take us far too long and would involve us in many sugyot and in going all over Shas and Poskim. But we'll do the basic stuff. So we're going to begin with an English précis, then I'll read out the rabbinical Hebrew, or I'll share that with Jean and Avi, and selections from the Ramaz halachic justification of his conducting a wedding on Shabbat. But what I'd like to say before I begin is that when you've read a lot of tshuvot, you realize that actually the answer to the practical question comes before the legal justification. In other words, it's clear that the posek makes up his mind as to where he wants to go, and he will then marshal the sources accordingly. Now, of course, it doesn't mean he can do whatever he wants. Posek has to practice law, and halacha has got limits too. But there are what a famous Jewish jurisprudence called leeways of choice. There are ways of choosing between different views, and when you make that choice, you'll get to the answer that you want to get to. So you are constrained by the parameters of the world of legal sources, but there's a lot of wiggle room there. And I think that the phrase used by Justice Stone, leeways of choice, is an excellent one, okay? There is leeway, and you can choose. So it is these leeways of choice and the way in which you mix and match that gets you to where you want to be. So let's have a look and see how this is illustrated in the Ramaz Tshuva. I have a but on my left, yes?
You want to be someone particular because you think that's where sources will take you. It's not just that you wake up one morning and say, well, I'd like to.
I said that. I said it's not that you make up your mind and you just do whatever you want. There are constraints and there are leeways of choice, but you have to, but you will be choosing. Let's just have a look now and see the first bit, okay? Line number 5. Shmuley, you're, as usual, first up on my screen for the English. So let's go with the Mancunian. The Ramah begins
with a discussion of the Mishnaic ruling regarding certain classes of acts that are prohibited by the rabbis on Shabbat and Yom Tov because they are likely to lead to a breach of a biblical prohibition.
One of these
is marriage, which is placed under the rubric of non-mandatory acts, a reshut, as opposed to mandatory mitzvot, and is forbidden because one may forget it is a holy day and write the ketubah in the Bavli, or because marriage provides financial benefits to the husband as per the Yerushalmi.
The Yerushalmi says that when you marry, your wife becomes your wife's earnings, and anything your wife may find which is of value will be owned by you. Now, this idea of married women not being able to own property goes back a long time, and it was preserved in the Western world until the 19th century, okay? But there are two different views of why there is a gzerah, why there is a rabbinic prohibition on marriage. One is that you might forget it's Shabbat, marriage on a Shabbat. I forget it's Shabbat and write the ketubah, so by habit you will break Shabbat, or because you actually are acquiring financial benefits for yourself on Shabbat, making a contract, doing a deal, which you cannot do, okay? The Gemara
objects to this classification. Sorry.
Right, and asks
why marriage does not fall into the rubric of mitzvah, seeing that it involves the mitzvah through uvuv.
Okay, so the Mishnah says there are things that are forbidden because they are shvut, as we'll see. They are neutral acts that you shouldn't do because you might break a biblical prohibition. There are acts which you shouldn't do on Shabbat because they are reshut. because they're not entirely neutral. There is a mitzvah quality there. And finally, there are things which are pressing direct mitzvot, which you shouldn't do on Shabbat by rabbinical decree, again, because you might come to do a rabbinical prohibition. So the category in which marriage is put is that of a reshut. It's got a mitzvah element, but it's not a direct, compelling mitzvah. And then the Gemara asks a question. It says, but come on, what's the first mitzvah in the Torah? Beruravu.
No.
So what do you mean it's not a direct mitzvah? It's a direct mitzvah incumbent upon anybody who can fulfill it, and God gets very angry with those males, and it applies to males only, who put the mitzvah off. So come on, why isn't this called a mitzvah? So then the answer is, so let's have somebody reading line 12. Jack, would you take us please from line 12, the second word, the Gemara's answer?
The Gemara's answer is that the Mishnah's classification applies only to a man who has already fulfilled the mitzvah.
In other words,
Not yet.
The Gemara says, okay, so a man who has already fulfilled the mitzvah Pururavu, well then marriage for him is somewhat mitzvah-like, because there may be a mitzvah to get married, okay, and it's also a mitzvah, even if you have fulfilled Puruvu, to continue producing children. As the prophet says, you will not rest, and in the evening too, you will continue being active, what we call la'erev. And then there's a general mitzvah, not midoraita, not one of the Tariag, to populate the world. So there are two mitzvot, la'erev and la'shevet. Okay? Baboker ta'aseh et avodatcha, ula'erev al tanach yadecha. Don't stop in the evening, continue. Or, lohu letohu v'ra'ah, God didn't create the world to be a wilderness. La'shevet yitzara, He created it that it would be populated. It's not the same as Peru or Ravu. And therefore, it's not called a mitzvah, it's called a reshut. Now, what does this answer of the Gemara mean? And Jack, will you continue, please? Line 13. Rashi explains.
Rashi explains that the Gemara's answer is really semantic. Namely, if he has no children, he may still not marry on a holy day, but his marriage falls into the category of mitzvah acts, consecrating animals and tithing, which are still forbidden because they are similar to commerce.
So Rashi says it's a semantic thing. In other words, the Gemara asks a very good question. The answer given by the Gemara is a very fine answer, but all it does is it transfers marriage, some types of marriage, from the category of reshut to the category of a mitzvah. Say you don't have any children, okay? So you are liable to the full biblical mitzvah purubu. It's a mitzvah, and you still cannot do it on Shabbat or Yom Tov, just as the direct mitzvot such as Hekdesh, consecrating animals, taking Truma and Maser, because as soon as you have a thought, I'm going to be makdish an animal, consecrating it, or I'm going to take the Trumot or Masrot, the full mitzvah applies straight away. Rabbi said you don't do this on Shabbat or Yom Tov. They're similar to comments. In other words, Rashi, one leeway of choice is to say this Gemara doesn't allow you to do a marriage on Shabbat. It simply explains why the Mishnah used a particular term which surprised us. Why we call a marriage a reshut? It's a mitzvah. Rabbeinu Tam, however, Jack, please continue.
Rabbeinu Tam, however, disagrees with his grandfather and takes the Gemara's answer as the basis for a practical halachic ruling, namely one who has not yet performed the mitzvah may marry on the Shabbos. The Ramah then launches into the details.
Okay, so we will just stop there. That's from the Tosafot in Beitzah 36b Esvi Vaha. You can look it up, and it's a complicated Tosafot. But Rabbeinu Tam says it's not merely a semantic; it's real. In other words, if you have not fulfilled the mitzvah or Peru or Ravu, then you may marry even on a Shabbat and a Yom Tov, because it's not in any of the forbidden classifications. In other words, a question that the Gemara asked could go either semantically, what do the words mean, and just change the meaning, the understanding of the words in the Mishnah, or does that fact that the Gemara takes marriage when you have not fulfilled the mitzvah out of the category of reshut and not put it into the category of a mitzvah, does that mean that you can marry? And that's what I mean by leeway of choice. When you go back to the Gemara and you look at the Rishonim and you see there are different ways of understanding the sugya, they could have practical ramifications. So now, who are we going to decide? Rashi, in which case we cannot do a marriage on Shabbat ever, or Rabbeinu Tam, who says you could do a marriage on Shabbat if you have not fulfilled the mitzvah of Purut Revu, because the Mishnah hasn't included you in any of the forbidden categories. It's a good leeway of choice. We don't know. Machloket Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, there are lots of them, but it gives the posek wiggle room. Avi, please. Let's take from line
The
the Ramah.
Ramah then launches into a detailed analysis to demonstrate why Rabbeinu Tam's view is preferable.
And according to Rabbeinu Tam, you will be able to do a marriage on Shabbat for someone who has not fulfilled Puruvu. Correct? Correct. And also
how it would be possible to square Rashi's interpretation with a permissive ruling in the case of a groom who has no children.
Now, I haven't taxed you with that. It's a very ingenious argument. Look at the Tuvah. But let's make sure we've got the basic choice situation clear. The Mishnah says, Kol shechayavin alav mishum shvut, mishum reshut, mishum mitzvah b'Shabbat, chayavin alav b'Yom Tov. 3 categories of forbidden activities on Shabbat and Yom Tov. Ve'elohei mishum shvut. This is the neutral type of shvut, which is a general term for something which is forbidden rabbinically because you might fall into a biblical prohibition. Lo olin be'ilan. We don't climb trees. Why don't we climb trees? You might break a branch. And what happens if you break a branch? What do you do? Which of the 39 avot melacha?
Clean up.
Kotzer, you're reaping. You
need an ambulance to go to hospital.
Thank you. The lo rochvin al gabei behema, and you don't ride, Avi?
Oh, the lo rochvin al gabei behema.
Why not?
Because you might break off a branch and spur it on.
Exactly. The lo
shatin al pnei hamayim.
Why not?
Because you might take a towel and squeeze it out.
No, it can make.
Jean, what might you make?
Comment on dit, une bouée, something to hide, to
exactly, to float on. To float on. You might take reeds, Avi. Look at the Mishnah, and you might make some type of float, okay? That you can learn to swim with. What's the
Velometapchin? You don't climb.
No.
No.
What's velometapchin? We don't clap.
To clap the hands?
Exactly, we don't clap the hands, velomasapkin, and we don't smack our thighs to rhythm, velomaraktin, and we don't dance. Why don't we do these 3 things?
Might lead to playing an instrument.
So music.
Could make an instrument of music.
Exactly. Thank you, Jean, as always. Comme toujours. Shema yaseh kli shir or letaken kli shir. In those days, musical instruments were very simple, and you might very well make yourself something that was a drum or something, and that is either makeh b'patish or it's something else. But these are real concerns, so we don't do anything.
How do Hasidim get around these problems?
We're going to get to that soon, Arnie. Excellent question. Don't we go clapping today and we get very excited?
Exactly.
Okay? Happy clapping, Friday night, Karabach, and dancing. How do the Hasidim? Okay. Breslov on a Friday night. Everybody bursts into dance at some stage with a Chatan, right? Are they in breach of the Mishnah Masechet Beitzah? Okay, let's see what happens there. Velu Hemeshum Reshut. Okay, Jean, would you like to continue, please? Line 25. Thank you, Avi. Ve'elu hen
Lo-
mishum reshut.
Lo danim,
Right? Velo,
mekatchin,
velo,
cholzim,
velo.
chalitza, velo meyavmin,
Okay, now
Yibum.
these are things that are called reshut. You
Mm.
don't have to do them here and now. They include having a din Torah, making a Jewish court to decide a dispute. Mekadshin is our kiddushin. We don't marry. Velo cholzin, and we don't do chalitza, velo meyavmin, or yibum. Okay. So there's a mitzvah element here. These are things that the Torah discusses, and there's a time and a place for doing them, but they're not pressing right now. Ve'elu hen mishum
Mitzvah,
lo.
lo makdishin, donc le makdish behema, velo
Okay.
ma'arichin,
And that is you don't promise
evaluate,
your own value, arachin, to the Bet Midrash or someone else's value. Velo machrimin.
macharimin, donc
And that is
cherem,
no, yeah, which means if I have a very nice thing, I say that will go to the Bet Mikdash. Difference between Hekdesh and Erech is that Hekdesh is money, I give the value of a nice thing, and Cherem is I give the actual thing itself. So Haram in Arabic means it's consecrated and nobody else can touch it. So they call the Harabait the Haram, okay? The Lo Magbihim
velo magbihim truma, umaaser.
and we don't take truma and a maaser. Kol elu b'yom tov amru kavachomer.
Vachomer b'Shabbat.
I'm going to leave that. It's a whole other topic. Ki ein ben yom tov l'Shabbat ela ochel nefesh b'lvad. Okay, so we know we can cook and do things connected with food and not of Gemara. לא עולין בעילה גזר השם יתלוש, ולא רכיל על גבי בהמה, גזר השם יצא מחוץ לתחום, שמע מילה תחומין דאורייתא, אלא גזר השם יחתוך זמורה, as Avi said. ולא שתין על פני המים, גזר השם יעשה חבית של שייטין, which was made of reeds, as I said, in those days, but they use the same idea as we do as a float. ולא מטפחים ולא מספקים ולא מרקדים, גזר השם יתקן כלישי. ואלו הן משום רשות, לא דנין. Then the Gemara says, what do you mean reshut? Lo dan
Mitzvah
din
kavit.
is a mitzvah. La tzricha deika da'adif minei. There's a better dayan in town, so it's not a mitzvah for you to do it on Shabbat or Yom Tov. That's why we downgrade it from a mitzvah to a reshut. V'lo mekadshin v'ha mitzvah ka'avid. So answer Jean.
Lo tzricha le'itle isha ubanim.
So that's the single guy. Now we have read, and let's see what the Ramah does with this, okay? First of all, he cites the whole sugya as we've just read. And then line 35, he says, Peresh Rashi Zal, line 36. והמצווה כעביד כדי לפרוט ולרבות, והמאי קרא רשות עד כאן לשונו. וכתבו התוספות, פירש הקונטרס, והרי למחשבינו בסייפא גבי מצוות. Marriage should have been considered a mitzvah. ומשני להצריכי דית לאישה ובנים. Our Mishnah. And this is again something that the Gemara always does. It defines, often limits the scope of the Mishnah. Mishnah is impossible really to apply in real life. And the Tanaim are called Mavalei Olam, destroyers of the world. If you only learn Mishnah, you would be doing bad things because you don't understand the niceties and the limited way in which the Mishnah is meant to apply. So that's why the Gemara always reduces the scope of the Mishnah. So here you understand that word, that phrase la mekadshin, we do not marry, only apply to somebody who has already fulfilled the mitzvah. Okay? ולקח אינו מצווה כל כך דומיה דהני דסייפא. ולפי זה יכול להיות גם בדלקה דעדיף מיני אין דנין, וכן גם באישה דמשני דית לאישה, ובנים משמע אפילו אין לו אישה, ובנים מכל מקום אסור. Rashi says it's always forbidden. Our Gemara simply shifts the term from reshut to mitzvah, but it's always asur to do a marriage on Shabbat. וכתבו וזה לשונם, יש מפרשים, and that's Rabbeinu Tam, הדק אמר והמצווה כעביד, ואמי גזרו, קורא משני לא צריכה דית לאישה ובנים, אבל אין לו מותר לקדש למצווה כעביד, but it's not considered as part of the mitzvah that you can't do, and therefore, you could do a marriage on Shabbat. That's the way Rabbeinu Tam reads the Gemara. This is your leeway of choice. And so the Tosafot have arguments in favor of Rashi's interpretation, arguments in favor of Rabbeinu Tam's interpretation. Ki katvu sham sheyesh hamefarshim hu Rabbeinu Tam. Ve'viu Yerushalmi, and then there's a Yerushalmi that talks about the fact that you cannot marry a widow on a Shabbat. The Kansin Armelit. You have to wait mibod yom so you koneking numbers. That is a Yerushalmi, but that's only a widow. What happens if you're not a widow? You might be able to marry on Shabbat. Umafarish hatam tama dad shelo kana eino zakai b'mitziuteha v'lo b'maseh yadeh. That's what I mean when I said that when you don't. By the way, Rabbi Akiva Eiger very famously wrote in a definitive essay, we do not buy or purchase a wife in Jewish law. The word kinyan is there to give us a biblical anchor, as Gemara in Kedushin says, that Ephron and Abraham lakach. The word kicha comes to, as it were, symbolize and give a biblical basis to making a binding agreement. Rabbi Akiva Eiger is very strong on the fact that we do not buy women, they are not property, you cannot deal with them as chattels. All that is a misconception. And of course,
Kicha stay from. The Gemara emphasizes the Kicha stay from.
Exactly, stay from. It wants to say that this is because there's a biblical basis to somehow having an agreement that something passes from one person's property to another. You might agree or disagree with Rabbi Akiva Eiger, but he's a great name. And the fact that he actually writes a whole essay to try and show you that the expression lakachat or kicha is not crass commercialism in relation to one's wife, but is somehow looking for a biblical anchor for some type of solemn undertaking, is what there's a short point I'm trying to make. If you want me to give you a longer exposition, Arnie, you'll have to ask me in your free time and my free time, okay? But for the time being, just a point that I wanted to make on the side, because many people make a mistake and think that the fact that the Gemara says Ayishan Nikneit and Kicha, it's not crass commercialism. Of course, you can always argue with me, but the Gemara, the Yerushalmi, says that we will not marry widows unless it is still Friday and Shabbat has not yet come in, because you make a kinyan, as we learned. And you don't get your wife's findings if they're valuable, or if she goes out to work and brings in a wage, until there is a proper marriage. And clearly that phrase, Armelin, probably means when she's a widow, but he's a widower. So therefore, you have to put Gemara and the on Yerushalmi. Now the Rama chooses to go with Rabbeinu Tam, and he gives you a lot of arguments. So I'm speaking to the person on my left now. I think that's what I mean by a leeway of choice. You have the basic sugya, and then you have the Rishonim who differ in its interpretation. Then the question is, which one do you choose? And the Ramah works hard to show that it is Rabbeinu Tam. However, at the end of the day, Alan, would you like to read from line 8, please? At the end of the analysis.
Okay. At the end of the analysis, Rema admits that the majority of poskim seem to rule according to Rashi.
Now, so the Ramah is a bit of a bind. In other words, the analysis of the Gemara could go either way, but the weight of precedent is with Rashi. Okay. However, okay, we can still get to where he wants to go when we load on the idea of kavod habriyot. But the important thing, as we learned from the Maharshal, is your starting point. If you can say that the direction I want to go in is justified in the Talmud, in the Gemara itself, and I could interpret the Gemara in a lenient way, then you're already one street ahead. Then you have to deal with the fact that there are different views amongst the poskim. So I could read off the Rif, the Rambam, the Rosh, the Tur, okay? But I'm not going to read the whole thing. Let's just go to the next point, which is Alan, line 17, justifying the wedding.
Justifying the wedding on the basis of kavod habriut and Rabbeinu Tam's
Yeah, I think you want to say habriot, which
habriot,
is
sorry.
it's not briut.
Correct, yes. And Rabbeinu Tam's understanding of Beitzah 36b.
Okay, so line 19. However,
since what is at stake is the dignity of the orphan bride, kavod habriot, one may rely upon Rabbeinu Tam because of the exceptional circumstances, sha'at hadachak, and the fact that, as far as Ramah is concerned, Rabbeinu Tam's understanding of the Talmud is the correct one.
okay, so here you got a typical move. I have two views in the Talmud. I can then pull out of my sleeve a principle called human dignity, kavod ha-briot. And that allows me to take issue, to wade into the disagreements amongst early authorities and possibly support a minority position as opposed to the majority when it is shat hadchak, okay? When it is an emergency, and we remember the emergency. Arnie, would you please read from line 21? Thank you, Alan. He also support.
Shat hadchak and kavod habriut are two different elements, which each of them could justify. But here, both are together in this case.
Jean, mathematics and law are very different, as so is astronomy. The best thing in law is to laharbot b'ta'anot. The more arguments you have, the better. In mathematics, we want the one right answer, okay? But this is not mathematics, it's law. And what you're doing, Jean, is you're doing rhetoric. You want to convince as many readers as possible that you're right. That's why legal judgments run into many pages. And brilliant mathematical theses can be 10 pages, okay? Because there's one correct answer. But the whole point of law is to convince as many people, so you want to have many arguments. In other words, harbu alai, instead of masau matan as we read in this week's parsha, harbu alai ta'anot v'nimukim, give me many, many, many proofs, and then I will convince you that I'm correct. So you're quite right. But dignity is one. And then the idea of shat hadchak, it's an emergency. We have a lot turning on this, okay? We feel pressured to do something for the orphan bride. This and more will help the Ramah justify and hopefully convince the rabbinic critics who are waiting outside with their swords drawn, okay, to accept that he does have a legitimate halakhic argument. So where were we? Okay.
End of 21.
He, the last word in 21,
yeah.
he?
Yeah, line 22. He also
finds support among later Ashkenazi authorities for performing a marriage when the groom has not yet fulfilled the mitzvah when faced with this type of exceptional circumstance. Mikol Makom.
If you'd like to have a crack at the Hebrew, continue.
No, this looks, I'm already stuck on the first line.
Okay.
Ikar lahatir inyan b'kohen agadol?
No,
The
but
Kahal Gavna.
Kahal Gavna, in a case such as this, we could permit Shahaya.
Shahaya shat hadchak.
Okay, Shaya shat hadchak והייתה בתולה מתביישת, תמתין עם החופה אחר תפילתה עד לאחר השבת. Now he says some interesting things. He says that why is it a shat hadchak? Why are we under such pressure? Because we have prepared the kala to go under the chuppah. Okay, she's gone to the mikveh. She's done her tevilah. And she's also wearing a hinuma, a veil. And what is going to be veiled the whole of Shabbat until they get to Motzei Shabbat, and then they agree or not. V'lasot hanisuin b'yom rishon, if they have a Sunday, that's from Motzei Shabbat, a Sunday wedding. That would be kederech ha'ezrachim. Who Who are the Ezrachim? The
The
non-Jews,
Goyim.
the Goyim, okay? And they have Sunday weddings because it's a holy day. So we're going to make this good Jewish world get married on a Sunday in Catholic Poland in the 16th century. And we can rely upon Rabbeinu Tam because it's Shatat Chak. And then the Ramah doesn't let you forget. And I think that Sugya Dishmata is the line of argument in the Gemara supports Rabbeinu Tam. Very important, okay, to have the Gemara on your side. וכן פסק בהגת האושרי, סוף פרק אחד דיני ממונות בשם אור זרוע. Rabbi Moshe, okay,
Devina.
Or Mivina, the famous Or Zarua, also paskins like Rabbeinu Tam. V'chen katav, and this is what he wrote. This is the Or Zarua. Rabbeinu Tam wrote b'tshubato ve'ivia smag, and the Sefer Mitzvot Gadol Rabbi Moshe of Kuchi we talked about. Ki b'tocha gadoli tirur kadesh b'Shabbat, because of great pressure he permitted. V'lo haya moreken halacha l'maaseh ad kan lishono. But the smag adds, but Tam never said you can. He just said you might be able to. Mashma miu b'brocha gadol yesh latir. But because this is the Ramah, he didn't teach it as halakha l'maaseh. That means that he doesn't say it can never be done. In the case of docha gadol, he's giving you the option if you really need it. Ve'en docha gadol mizeh. This is a typical response. And this is can you imagine a more docha case, a more pressing case than this one? Shall I tell you, Tomag Dola mitbayeshet, this will cause great shame to an orphan. And aren't we meant to, above all, support the dignity of the orphan, the stranger, and the Levite, okay, the ones who don't have property, don't have status? Their dignity should be preferred to the dignity of anyone else. And they will always figure her out as either the jilted bride or the bride who had to spend the whole of Shabbat in her bridal costume and get married on a Sunday. This feeling of being forced to be unusual, standing out, is an impugning of human dignity. V'gadol kavod habriot shedoche lo taseh, lo tasur mikol hadvarim asher yorucha. Now, what does this mean? And we will learn the Gemara because we're going to learn a whole lot of cases next week. But what this means is that there is a Yerushalmi that says that great is human dignity, it overrides a negative commandment. What's a negative commandment? You shall not deviate from that which the rabbis tell you. Lot asur. In other words, when it comes to a rabbinical prohibition, you can always rely on human dignity to override that prohibition. If it's only rabbinically forbidden, and marriage is only rabbinically forbidden, according to all the Talmuds. שלנו, או משום דוד קונה קינם בשבת כמפרש ירושלמי. כמו שהתברר לעתיד, and I'm going to explain all this to you later on. מלבד דהבי לן למחש בכאן שלא נתבטלו השידוכים. It's also possible that the whole marriage will implode. להתבטל הזיווג מכוח הקטטות והמריבות שביניהם. And simply the girl will be left, she has no family that has any money, she'll be left forever in her unmarried status, okay? Sie wollen setzen, versetzen.
Galen, can you hear me?
Versetzen in the shtetl. Could we please have a quiet there? עד שרצו להסיר העניימה מעל ראש הכלה מכוח ביצוע הקטטות. They were then considering, saying, well, to the bride, take off your hinuma, go home. V'gadol hashalom ben ish lishto. We talked about the origin of hinuma last time, okay? And you'll remember either the Greek word or the dozing of the kala in her tent. So the Mishnaic prohibitions no longer apply. Now the Ramah has another iron in his fire. Irving, would you like to read? I can see you. But you have to unmute. If you want to read, you have to.
Okay.
Line 37, the Ramah.
The Rama makes the point that the Mishnaic prohibitions on clapping, thigh slapping, and dancing,
They're
shvut,
all called shvut.
no longer apply since the Tosafot distinguished between the Talmudic period in which they assumed that people were capable of making a musical instrument on the spot and their period in which this was no longer possible.
Okay, Arnie, are you listening?
I am.
Arnie, the answer to
Yes.
your question. Tosafot
Yes.
say, well, the Gemara is, say, 4th and 5th centuries. Tosafot are the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th, and possibly 15th centuries, high Middle Ages. Can we make a Stradivarius there and then on a Shabbat afternoon? Our musical instruments are much more sophisticated. So therefore, we're allowed to clap and to slap our thighs and to dance because we're not going to make the type of musical instruments that we are used to. Apparently, in the times of the Talmud, it was much more primitive, and you could put a musical instrument together, call it a musical instrument in a much more primitive way. Okay, therefore, Irving, we engage.
But I
Right.
suppose that the Tosafot justifies what the people were doing, and it does not make a psak a priori, but a posteriori.
Okay, now you could get me. That's again an excellent point. You could get me on a long shiur for about 3 hours on the job of the Tosafot. But very briefly, I will say that you're partly right. In other words, we find that Tosafot use their ingenuity to justify many things that people do. Certainly in Masechet Avodah Zarah, which is a great example, a lot of things that were prohibited by the Talmud, like not trading with non-Jews close to their feast days, couldn't apply practically in the Middle Ages because if you considered Christianity to be Avodah Zarah, most of the markets were held close to feast days. So Jews would be cut out from money lending or commerce. Well, commerce before the First Crusade, money lending afterwards. So they do work hard, but they always have some type of proof. And sometimes they actually use something directly of a historical nature. So you can accept this or not. There are some people, halakhic purists, who might say, don't clap, don't slap your thigh, and never dance, never on a Saturday. But as we said, the Hasidim and the Karlbachists and all the other people who love dancing and are happy clappy, I would hope that good Litvaks will refrain from dancing and clapping and thigh clapping on Shabbat and Yom Tov, but you never can tell. All right. So as I said, Jean, you've opened up a huge area. And I'll just say that, yes, there's a lot to say about that. One of the jobs of Tosafot is to justify what people were doing at the time so that they shouldn't feel bad. But remember, people didn't know the Gemarot either, and the Tosafot were responsible for spreading the knowledge of Talmud. So it's a bit like, well, you didn't know that this was wrong. Suddenly you see a text which you've learned and you say, wow, aren't we doing the wrong thing? And then your rabbis have to come and say, whilst we taught you this sugya in the yeshiva, in actual real life, it can be done. And we know that from what goes on in our time as well. Okay, let's have one more line, please, Irving.
We engage in all three activities freely on Shabbat and Yom Tov.
Okay, so therefore, we should be able to have a very similar argument. So I don't know. Is Gilad Berman interested in reading? The answer is not. Yes, he is. Gilad?
Yes, what line are we?
We are on page 3, line 2. This reasoning
is equally applicable to weddings. They were prohibited according to the Bavli because of the concern that the Ketubah would be written on Shabbat by, I can't see anymore.
By the groom. Can you see now?
By the groom at the actual ceremony. Today, this concern no longer applies since we lack the expertise to write Ketubot. And
Ah,
doing
you
so has
see the
been
analogy between not making a musical instrument and not writing a ketubah. Ramah says, look, do we really write ketubot today? Does the Chatan come and write a ketubah? Nobody knows
no.
how to write a ketubah. You have to have a professional. Gilad, back, please.
And doing
One other
so has
thing,
been
one other question. The
Yeah,
Adim perform their edus without actually signing. We
No, the
have the
Edim
Adim sign
sign.
the tuba, but
Yeah,
not the Adim Kedushin. We don't have them sign anything.
correct. The Eidei ketubah should sign. But if they don't sign there and then, but they testify orally, that's also enough. Okay, so you could say we'll have the wedding, we'll have the ketubah, and they won't sign. So the Ramah says, well, you won't even have a ketubah. There's no concern. He's starting with the more strict. We're going to write a ketubah. That's what the Gemara says. No, you're not going to write a ketubah today in the 16th century Poland because nobody knows how to write the ketubah except a professional. Ian.
why can't it all be prepared ahead of Shabbat?
It is prepared, and therefore there's no reason why you shouldn't have the wedding on Shabbat, is there? Exactly. And
Right.
doing so, let Gilad read the rest of this, please.
and doing so has become the sole prerogative of the Beit Din official, who always does so well in advance of the chuppah.
Ian, did you read perhaps the rest of your line in advance of your question? Sure, we do it before. So everything is fine. Friday morning, the scribe has sat down, the whole ketubah is ready. Thank you, Gilad. Stephen Singer, would you like to read? No? Okay, we'll move on to Julian.
But the Chatan must make a kinyan and accept. The Edim can testify only if the Chatan accepted.
That's interesting. It's a question of whether the again, I'm going to go back to Rabbi Akiva Eger and say perhaps it's not the same sort of kinyan as we make over commercial matters. It's a symbolic kinyan. If it's a symbolic kinyan, it's a good question. The symbolic kinyan will not have the same commercial problem as a kinyan over a contract. If it's a kinyan over the kiddushin, of the sanctity of the relationship, and not commercial at all, then you may.
But afile glime she'alav, donc it's commercial. He takes the responsibility of all what he has.
Okay, that is the actual formula that's written there. But what is the point here? Okay. Okay. So, but according to the Bavli, the issue is not the commercial aspect. The issue is the writing aspect. Because ktiva in Hebrew or in Aramaic, as we know, is an isur mid oraita. So what I'm saying to you again, following Rabbi Akiva Eger, who's got a very long essay on this, is that the ketubah, even though it speaks in very commercial terms, can also be interpreted as a symbol of bekushta. That was everything I do. I'll be sincere. I will treat you well. And we regard the language as being a symbol of a much more underlying human relationship, which would not be considered to be commercial. So I'm taking the whole ketubah out of the strictly commercial. According to the Yerushalmi, this would not work, but that's the next point that he makes, and you'll hear this very shortly. We follow the Bavli and not the Yerushalmi. So I don't know whether Julian Liu is there, but if I don't have a reply, I'm going to go back to the top of the list. And Ian, you haven't read. So let's have a look. Line 7, the situation is similar.
Situation is similar to the other Torah reading. We no longer expect those called up to the Torah to read their portion, but rely instead on professional Baalei Kriya. Now, this argument does not apply to the reason given for the rabbinic decree in the Yerushalmi.
Jean, You get that, okay? We're now
Mhm.
saying Bavli versus Yerushalmi. Bavli focuses on writing a ketubah. That's the problem. That's what the rabbi is saying, no marriage. Yerushalmi is different. That talks about commercialism. And therefore, the Bavli, according to Rabbi Akiva Eger, doesn't want to interest itself in the commercial aspect at all, because the commercial aspect is secondary, ancillary, okay, to the main thing, which is a symbol of a commitment and a marriage.
Zugiyut.
Yeah.
Right. So now this,
Argument.
Yerushalmi, namely the acquisition by the husband of financial rights respecting his wife. Nevertheless, since we rule according to the Bavli and not the Yerushalmi, it is proper to rely on Rabbeinu Tam in order to override the prohibition for the sake of preserving the dignity of the orphan bride.
So that's all in the next section in Hebrew, okay? Interestingly, he calls the Sofer the Chazan, okay? The Chazan kotev kol pam haktuba v'shitrei harusin v'shacharit ozman rav kodem. It's prepared beforehand. כאשר לא יודע מתי יהיו מוכנים מהחופה, ולכן אין לחוש בזמן הזה לגזרה זו כלל. So Ramah says actually that whole gzera that we learned about in the Mishnah doesn't apply today. According to the Bavli, we're not going to write a ketubah there and then. If you have a wedding on Shabbat, your ketubah will be written well in advance. And you can get around the other aspects by doing them later on Motzei Shabbat. And he also wants to say that V'afim Nomar, I'm on line 25. The Lefi Direi Yerushalmi de Peresh Tamag Zera Mishum Dahavi Konek in Shabbat En Lechalek Ben Zman Hazel B'Yimeihen Mikol Makom Nireh the Gemara Didan Ikar Neged HaYerushalmi V'chen Pesua Poskim Tamid. And that's why he says that neither the Rif or the Rosh cite Yerushalmi, and they don't talk about the Sugya of the Armelin, those widowers who marry widows, okay? And because we all follow our Gemara. And the fact is that we will have in Poland certainly weddings on Friday afternoon, as we said. And if we were really concerned about the possibility of writing on Shabbat the Ketubah, we would never dare to have a wedding on Friday. But we do. That's as the Ramah proves that we're not concerned. מטעם שכתוב האחרונים ז"ל, והעיקר משום שעכשיו אנו בגלות, וצריכה לעשות נישואים בלא שבת. He says, look, you need to have the wedding on Friday because you need to save money and you need to have the Friday meal, the wedding feast. מכל הנ"ל נתבהר שמותר לקדש בשבת במקום הדחק, ובמקום שיש לחוש לכבוד. So now we put everything into the pot, okay? We've got Rabbeinu Tam, we've got Shat HaDchak, we've got Kavod HaBriot Shel Lo Yavo Adavar Lidei Kisufa. What does the word Kisufa mean? Shame. Shame. Kisufa is shame. We're not putting the bride to shame. Ve'efshar lavo lidei bitol ha'zivug, and then you could cancel the whole marriage. L'smoch al Rabbeinu Tam hamekel b'davar v'chasher nitba'er. Therefore, rely upon Rabbeinu Tam. So, the last point raised by the Ramah. Okay, Avi, I'm back to you. Line 33. The last point.
The last point raised by the Ramah relates to an opinion of Isaac of Corbey.
Corbey, the smart. Sefer Mitzvot Katan. We have Sefer Mitzvot Gadol. Now we have Sefer Mitzvot Katan. Number 194.
That marriage is forbidden on holy days on the basis of the Talmudic ruling with regard to the need for a married Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur.
What's the famous sugya? Remember Masechet Yoma. What do you learn about the Kohen Gadol and his wife?
He must have a wife.
Exactly, Jean.
And what happened if she died?
Exactly. What happens if your wife, the Kohen Gadol's wife, dies on Yom Kippur and he's wifeless? He cannot do a kapara. It has to be lo uleveto. Okay? Pashati ani uveiti. Beiti means his wife. Bayit is isha. And if for 1 minute on Yom Kippur the Kohen is wifeless, his kapara is useless. Wifeless and useless. So, what are we going to do to say the Kohen? The whole of Klal Yisrael depends upon his kapara. We got to do something. He's got to have a wife in reserve waiting in the wings. How do we get him to have a wife in reserve? Okay. But he can only have one wife. Beito, says the Torah. Okay. We have to have a kapara. So it can't be Beitav, one wife. So we got a problem. Monogamy is required and wifefulness is required. But what happens if she dies? That's a major problem for the whole of Klal Yisrael. Avi, read on line 35. The Kohen Gadol.
Kohen Gadol must be married in order to atone properly. In order to deal with the eventuality that his existing wife may die during the day, he must have a second wife waiting in the wings. At the same time, however, he can only have one wife.
Because it says Beito. Okay,
Beito.
in order.
In order to solve the problem of being monogamous, but also having a second wife waiting in the wings, the Gemara explains that the Kohen Gadol would marry wife number 2 before Yom Kippur began and immediately divorce her on condition that his existing wife does not die. If she does, then the get will no longer be valid, and the Kohen Gadol will immediately resume his status as a married man.
There's no end to Talmudic ingenuity. So he actually marries wife number 2 after Mincha and Erev Yom Kippur, but he divorces her there and then and says this get is a get al tanai. So what? The whole of the nation of Israel depends upon the Kohen Gadol. So
but what does wife number 1 do while he's marrying wife number 2?
No. As soon as he marries wife number 2, he divorces her.
Yeah, but isn't wife number 2 then a Grisha, and he cannot remarry her in case the first wife dies?
He certainly cannot. A Kohen Gadol cannot. He's only marrying her to have a wife in reserve during Yom Kippur. That's all.
But there's still a certain, like a few minutes in which he's married to 2 women. He hasn't divorced wife number 1. He's marrying wife number 2 and immediately divorcing her, but there is a time.
Immediately divorces her.
He's allowed to have 2 women.
He's allowed to have more than one wife before Yom Kippur, Yael. He can have 6 wives. The only thing is that once Yom Kippur starts, he's got to have a wife, but only one.
Yes, but how does this work?
Happy wife, happy life.
Jack, yes. How does this work?
And why doesn't he Mekadesh
one at a time? One at a time. We can't have.
If he divorces wife number
Jack, Jean. Okay, Jack.
If he divorces wife number 2, and then wife number 2 dies.
No. He's divorcing her. He's divorcing
her. Wife number 1 dies. He has to remarry wife number 2, and she is a Grisha.
The assumption is that 2 wives will not die on that one Yom Kippur day.
That makes no difference. That's not that's the question.
Yeah, but you could say, let him marry 2 wives and divorce them both on Erev Yom Kippur. The chances of both of them dying together with his first wife on Yom Kippur are very, very small. Okay? Jack?
Don't the Rabbanim...
Now, just a second. Jean was next. Yes. Jean?
Yes. What
What's
happens?
the question?
Instead of divorcing her, he could marry her on tonight that if the other dies, then the Kiddushin will be Chal.
אין תנאי בקידושין.
יש הרבה לדבר על זה.
יש הרבה לדבר, but that's...
Rabbanim have a problem with a get al tanai? Don't the Rabbanim have a problem with a get al tanai?
No, the whole idea of gitei milchama, the get that you go when you go to war, is a get al tanai. Much easier to do a get al tanai than kiddushin al tanai for obvious reasons. Because when the husband goes away, he's away. You can say it's a get. but when you have Kiddushin al Tanai, you have Kiddushin. The people are living together. 20 years later, you want to say, well, the Tanai doesn't apply. Okay, but this takes us into a sugya we'll probably do. You're not. Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening.
Good to see you. So we're having a very exciting time here. But
Thank you. I hear.
Jean, of course, has you're not. You can read from line 1.
From line 1.
Question.
Rabbi, is a question why does the Gemara not solve the problem much more simply by having the Kohen Gadol remarry immediately upon the death of his wife?
Why doesn't the Gemara, instead of going into this marrying on Erev Yom Kippur, a second wife with a conditional get, say, look, if Mrs. Kohen Gadol sadly dies on Yom Kippur, immediately we have a new wife there, and the Kohen Gadol will slip in a Kiddushin between his various acrobatics during the service of Yom Kippur in the afternoon, and will solve the problem. The answer must be...
The answer must be that it is forbidden to marry on Yom Tov. Rama refuses this proof.
No, so the Samak has got a totally different proof for saying that you cannot do a marriage on Yom Tov. The proof is that the Gemara Masechet Yoma goes through this whole rigmarole to make sure that the Kohen is married even if his wife has died. So the fact that the Gemara does not say let him marry on Yom Kippur itself means that you cannot marry on Yom Tov. So the Rama has a problem because he says that you can marry Shatat, and this is certainly Shatat. The whole of Israel is waiting for the Kohen to do a kosher atonement, and he can't do it if he's not married. So the answer must be, so Rama refutes this.
Rama refutes this proof by observing that marital relations are forbidden on Yom Kippur. Hence, this simple solution will not work. And the problem has to be solved using the device of a conditional divorce.
In other words, what we have here is the answer. You cannot have intercourse with your wife on Yom Kippur. So the Kohen Gadol cannot marry on Yom Kippur because in order to have a wife, he's got to have intercourse. And if he can't have intercourse, and we don't do Tashmish on Yom Kippur, so that's why the Gemara says you got to have a conditional wife. So let me just read this. Umihu. Nir'eh, or I don't know, Gilad, are you still there?
Yes.
Gilad?
Yes, I'm here.
From the Hebrew, from line 7, Umihu nir'eh da'asur.
ומיהו נראה דאסור לכנוס, מעיד דפרקמא דיומא, דמצריך לכהן גדול, לכנוס ערב יום כיפור, ולגרשה על תנאי. וכמה דוחקים דחקו התם. ואם איתה היה יכול לומר, מיד שתמות אשתו הראשונה, יכנוס השנייה.
אלא, זה טרבית. Okay.
אלא שמע מינה, אסור לכנוס.
So, again, it's forbidden to marry, okay, because the Kohen Gadol has to get this wife ready and divorce her and then have her wait in the wings. והנה אני אומר, says the Rama,
דאפשר דשני מצוות פרייה ורבייה, שהיא מצווה גדולה, שאין מוכרים ספר תורה לשום מצווה בעולם, כי אם ללמוד תורה ולישא אישה.
Now, so the Rama actually in the text also goes into a couple of other things, and he says we know that Peru Ravu is very important, okay? And it is a mitzvah gdola, and that also is the reason why you might be able to marry, if you're single, certainly, and you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah, on Shabbat, okay? Because the Gemara in Megillah says you can sell a Sefer Torah only for two things. To learn Torah, you want to go and study in yeshiva, or to marry. Ma'amrinan דנענש
יהושע שלא הווה בן דביטל ישראל מפרייה ורבייה, ולא נענש על שביטל קורבן התמיד.
Okay, now this is something to do with the book of Joshua. You want to read Sefer Yoshua, well, you'll find that this is the Gemara in Eruvin, actually, Samach Gimel Amud Bet. The Gemara says that we find in Divrei Hayamim that Nun beno, okay, and Yoshua beno, that the line of Nun stopped with Yoshua. Yoshua had no children. Why didn't he have any children? The Gemara has a whole discussion of why you won't have children. It's a punishment. Perhaps you've been moreh halacha lifnei rabo. But the second answer is that because he kept Bnei Israel up all night to learn Torah, because he misjudged what the angel was telling him after the siege of Yericho. So this is a Gemara that it apparently says that if you prevent Pirya V'Rivya, it's a terrible thing, and Yoshua was childless, which according to the Talmud is the correct understanding because of the pasuk in Divrei Hayamim. We also know that Yoshua nullified, abrogated the Korban Tamid, but he isn't punished for that. So what the Ramah pushes in right at the very end is that you also have the power of Peru or Avu. So add to the Shita of Rabbeinu Tam, and the fact that you've got Shatat Chak, and you've got Kavod Habriot overrides all rabbinical prohibitions, and the proof of the Smak of Rabbi Yitzchak of Korbei doesn't work because Yom Kippur is different, because Tashmish Amita, intercourse is forbidden in Yom Kippur, and you cannot be married unless you go through Nisuin, which is intercourse. Finally, he says, and we've got Peru Ravu, which is a meta mitzvah. Gilad, would you please finish? ועוד.
ועוד, ביום כיפור אסור תשמיש המיטה, ולא מקרי וכיפר בעדו ובעד ביתו, עד דקניס לה לגמרי.
And Beito is his wife, and that's in the Torah. We read that on every Yom Kippur, וכיפר בעדו ובעד ביתו, and it's only one wife. So that's why the Gemara in Yomai, Daf Yud Gimel, goes to this whole thing with the conditional divorce. ולא מקרי,
ולא מקרה ביתו רק לאחר הכניסה לגמרי עם התשמיש, וזהו לא שייך ביום כיפור.
For totally different reasons, Yom Kippur, it's one of the Chameshet Inuyim min HaTorah. So we're going to conclude with the Ramah's permissive reading, which I'll read. Umali laharich. But anyhow, says Ramah, why should I go on and on and on and on? And I've only given you a fraction or part of what he actually writes. Puk chazi my amadabar. What does that mean?
Look what people are doing.
Look what people are doing. Okay, so Gemara Brachot, Daf Mem Hey. The question was there, which bracha do you make before water and what do you make after? There's a machloket. Whether Shakol before and Borena Fashot after, or Borena Fashot first and Shakol after. And the Gemara says, look, just go out and see, go out, chazisi, my ama, what people dabar are doing outside, brighter, bar. Okay, and that's also what we do to resolve halachic issues. Uveprat be'irenu, and in particular in our city, Krakow, Ashish ba kibbutz am toda lael. We've got one of the biggest communities in Europe, 1,500 Jews. Doesn't sound like much, but for the 16th century was an awful lot. V'lifamim umali bitchilat halayla osim hey ozvav chupot b'yom echad. And we will make on Friday afternoon, already in the winter, it's getting dark, 5 or 6 chupot b'yom echad nimshachim ad halayla, and they go on until night, and we make the wedding feast, the Friday night dinner, then potzeh pen mutzavtzev. We've been doing this for years, and nobody has ever complained that we might get into Shabbat, and we might therefore have a problem. Ha'emet shetzorech hasham mevi lahakel bidvarim elu, she'ein ele isurei isur. The Rabban. These are rabbinical isurim. Lo gazru. The rabbis never intended that the Gzerot should threaten the way we live as well as we can. Okay? Uvaha nachitna, uvaha salikna. And this is how we land, and this is how we take off. It's I think it's a Masechet Psachim, where we talk about how to handle a problem. We've always got this problem, but this is how we resolve it. Of course, everybody should take great care to marry before Shabbat, as early as possible. They shouldn't get into these problems, which were apparently not that unusual. We've done whatever we could. And the time just went by, and now it's well after nightfall. ויש לחוש לפירוד הזיווג, and the cost of not doing the wedding may very well be no wedding at all, no marriage, and perhaps a bride who never gets married, which in 16th century Poland is a tragedy. Or libiyush habatula, all the shame of having to spend all of Shabbat in a bridal gown and being remarked and remembered for that and marrying on Sunday. All shtetl talk. Hasomech lahakel lo hifsid. Rama says, look, if you're lenient, you've not lost at all. V'taneg l'shalom ba'onet Shabbat achar kach, and enjoy the pleasure of Shabbat because you will have deserved it. V'yichola mitzvah lechaper alav in kavanato l'shem shamayim. The mitzvah that you've brought about, peru ravu, okay, and the whole, all of these things, not preventing the tragedy or the shame or this or that, that is done sincerely, will help the person who did it. That's me. Na'u Moshe ben la'adoni avi mori harav Rabbi Yisrael, etc. Nikra Moshe Iselis Mikraka. So I'm going to stop the share. Okay, that is the tshuva. And what I plan to do, after having shown you a peek into the laboratory of a very courageous posek and a very warm and empathetic posek, as the Ramah was, we're going to go into this issue of kavod habriot. How far can the idea of preserving human dignity take us when we encounter clashes with halachic prohibitions? So that's all, God willing, next week. Okay? Same time, same place. And that's it for this evening, folks. Any questions or comments? Now's the time.
Line 9 is a conclusion of the Gemara of the Rama himself.
Line 9.
נקרא ביתו רק לאחר הכניסה לגמרי עם תשמיש.
That is the Rama citing.
Because it's far from certain if the wife is nida, she is married.
No. This is the Midrash Halakha. Now, when the Torah says in Vayikra, "V'cheper bado vad beito," Midrash Halakha says, "Beito zo ishto," and then the Ramah is adding, "V'la mikre beito rak la'achar haknisa legamre ima tashmish." But it's not only him. The Mefarshim on the Sifra also say exactly because they discuss it from the point of view: is it Erusin or is it Nisuin? As you know, in the old days, Erusin was 12 months before Nisuin. So the main Mefarshim on the Sifra say, yes, it has to be Nisuin. Erusin is not enough, and that's why we have to go through the whole thing of the conditional divorce. Okay, good. See you all next week. All being well in Yirtzeh Hashem. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.
Good evening. Thank you.
Good evening. Erev Tov, Laila Tov.
Erev Tov.
Thank you.
Bonsoir.
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 Thanks.